August 9th, 1945. At precisely 1 minute past midnight, Trans-Baikal time, the largest military operation in human history began with a thunderclap that would shatter Japan's last hope for survival. Along a front stretching over 4,000 miles, from the frozen shores of Sakhalin to the deserts of Mongolia, 1.5 million Soviet troops surged across the border into Japanese-controlled Manchuria. This wasn't just another battle. This was the moment Japan's war was truly lost, and most people don't even know it happened. While the world remembers August 9th, 1945, as the day America dropped the second atomic bomb on Nagasaki, something far more strategically decisive was unfolding thousands of miles away. As Fat Man exploded over Nagasaki at 11:02 that morning, Soviet tanks were already racing across the Manchurian plains, crushing the remnants of Japan's once mighty Kwantung army. The timing wasn't coincidental. It was calculated, methodical, and absolutely devastating. The story of how the Soviet Union delivered the knockout punch to Imperial Japan is one of the most overlooked episodes of World War II. It's a tale of diplomatic deception, logistical genius, and military precision that makes D-Day look like a practice exercise. By the time Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender 6 days later, the Soviets had accomplished what the United States had been trying to do for 4 years. They had made continued Japanese resistance mathematically impossible. But this story doesn't begin on August 9th. It begins 3 months earlier, in a bombed-out conference room in Berlin, where Stalin made a promise that would doom Japan. It begins with trains carrying 89 divisions across the Trans-Siberian Railway under absolute secrecy. It begins with Japanese diplomats desperately begging the Soviets for peace, while Soviet generals quietly positioned the largest invasion force ever assembled. The Japanese had no idea what was coming. Their intelligence services were blind. Their armies were hollowed out. Their leaders were living in a fantasy where the Soviet Union might save them from unconditional surrender. They were catastrophically wrong about everything, and by the time they realized their mistake, it was far too late. To understand the magnitude of this disaster, we need to go back to February 1945 to a seaside resort in the Crimea where 3 men carved up the post-war world. Winston Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt, and Joseph Stalin sat around a table at Yalta, and Roosevelt made a deal that would seal Japan's fate. The American president was terrified of Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan's home islands. Intelligence estimates suggested it would cost 1 million American casualties. Roosevelt desperately needed Soviet help to avoid that bloodbath. Stalin listened carefully to Roosevelt's pleas. The Soviet dictator had his own reasons for wanting to enter the Pacific War, but he wasn't going to do it for free. His price was steep. He wanted South Sakhalin returned to Soviet control. He wanted the Kuril Islands handed over. He wanted special rights in Manchuria and Mongolia. He wanted, in essence, to reclaim everything Russia had lost to Japan in their 1905 war, plus interest. Roosevelt agreed to everything. The secret protocol signed at Yalta committed Stalin to entering the war against Japan within 2 to 3 months of Germany's defeat. That meant the deadline was sometime in early August. Stalin circled the date on his calendar and began the most ambitious military redeployment in history. What happened next was a logistical miracle that defied every assumption about Soviet military capability. Between May and August 1945, the Soviet Union moved an entire army from Europe to Asia. 20 to 30 trains per day thundered across the Trans-Siberian Railway, carrying tanks, artillery, aircraft, fuel, ammunition, and nearly 750,000 troops from the recently concluded European theatre. This wasn't just moving personnel. This was relocating an industrial war machine across 6,000 miles of territory in absolute secrecy. The numbers were staggering. By early August, Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky commanded 1.5 million troops, organized into 3 massive fronts. The Trans-Baikal Front alone fielded 654,000 men, 2,359 tanks, and 1,360 aircraft. The First Far Eastern Front contributed another 586,000 troops, with modern equipment fresh from the German front. The Second Far Eastern Front added 337,000 more. Combined with supporting units, the Soviets had assembled 5,000 tanks, 28,000 artillery pieces, and 3,700 aircraft. Never before had so many soldiers been assembled under one field commander. The force Vasilevsky controlled was larger than the entire German army that had invaded the Soviet Union in 1941. It was bigger than the combined Allied forces that landed in Normandy. It represented the largest concentration of military power in human history, and it was aimed directly at Japan's most vulnerable point. The Japanese knew none of this. Their intelligence services, already decimated by 4 years of war, completely failed to detect the Soviet buildup. They saw some troop movements, some construction activity, but nothing that suggested an invasion force of unprecedented scale. Japanese military attachés in Moscow filed routine reports. There were no emergency meetings, no frantic reinforcement efforts, no preparation for what was about to hit them. This intelligence failure wasn't accidental. Stalin had orchestrated one of history's most successful deception campaigns. While secretly massing invasion forces, Soviet diplomats continued meeting with Japanese representatives, discussing possible peace negotiations. The Soviets strung Japan along, encouraging their hopes for a mediated settlement while simultaneously preparing to destroy them. The Japanese fell for it completely. Throughout the summer of 1945, Japan's leaders became increasingly desperate to secure Soviet mediation. They offered territorial concessions, economic deals, anything to keep the Soviets neutral and willing to negotiate with the Americans. Japanese Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo sent increasingly frantic messages to Ambassador Naotake Sato in Moscow, begging him to arrange meetings with Soviet officials. The Soviets played their role perfectly. They delayed responses, requested clarifications, suggested that Stalin was too busy to meet immediately but might be available soon. Every delay bought more time for the military build-up. Every meeting raised Japanese hopes, while Soviet trains continued rolling east. Meanwhile, the target of this massive operation was crumbling from within. The Kwantung Army, once the pride of the Japanese military, had been systematically gutted to reinforce other fronts. What remained in Manchuria by August 1945 was a hollow shell masquerading as a fighting force. On paper, the Kwantung Army controlled over 900,000 men in 31 divisions and 13 brigades. In reality, most of these units were filled with raw recruits, old men, and teenagers. The experienced troops had been shipped to the Philippines, Burma, and the Pacific Islands, where they died fighting Americans. The equipment situation was even worse. The Kwantung Army's 400 tanks were mostly obsolete models from the 1930s. Of their 2,000 aircraft, only 230 were actual combat types, and just 55 could be considered modern by 1945 standards. The rest were trainers, transports, and museum pieces. Heavy artillery was virtually non-existent. Anti-tank weapons were scarce. The army that was supposed to defend Japan's industrial heartland was equipped like a second-rate garrison force, but the Japanese High Command maintained the fiction that Manchuria was strongly defended. They moved units around on maps, created new paper divisions, and issued confident proclamations about the impregnable Kwantung Army. This self-deception was necessary to maintain morale, but it also prevented any realistic assessment of what would happen when the Soviets attacked. The strategic importance of what the Soviets were about to capture cannot be overstated. Manchuria wasn't just another territory. It was Japan's industrial lifeline, the source of coal, iron ore, steel, and manufactured goods that kept Japan's war machine functioning. Under Japanese occupation since 1931, Manchuria had been transformed into the most industrialized region in China. Japanese investment had created a comprehensive industrial network, producing everything from aircraft engines to synthetic fuels. The loss of Manchuria would mean more than territorial defeat. It would represent economic catastrophe on a scale that would make continued resistance impossible. Japan's home islands possessed virtually no natural resources. Every ton of steel, every gallon of fuel, every round of ammunition depended on imports from conquered territories. Manchuria provided the bulk of these critical supplies, and the Soviets were about to cut that lifeline forever. The Japanese leadership understood this vulnerability, which made their diplomatic delusions even more tragic. Throughout July 1945, as Soviet forces completed their final preparations, Japanese officials continued pursuing the fantasy of Soviet mediation. Emperor Hirohito himself had authorized secret approaches to Stalin, offering substantial territorial concessions in exchange for peace negotiations with the Americans. These overtures revealed the depth of Japanese desperation and the completeness of their strategic miscalculation. The Soviets encouraged these hopes right up until the moment of attack. On August 8th, just hours before the invasion began, Soviet Ambassador Yakub Malik met with Japanese representatives in Moscow. He listened politely to their latest proposals, promised to convey their message to Stalin, and suggested that a response might be forthcoming soon. That evening, as Japanese diplomats waited hopefully for Stalin's reply, Soviet artillery crews were already moving into position along the Manchurian border. At 11 p.m. Moscow time on August 8th, Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov summoned Japanese Ambassador Naotake Sato to the Kremlin. Sato arrived expecting to discuss peace negotiations. Instead, Molotov handed him a declaration of war. The document was brief and devastating. The Soviet Union accused Japan of rejecting peace proposals and announced that it would join the Allies in war against Japan effective immediately. Sato was stunned. He stammered questions about the Neutrality Pact, about ongoing diplomatic discussions, about the possibility of misunderstanding. Molotov's responses were coldly formal. The decision was final. The meeting lasted less than 10 minutes. As Sato stumbled out of the Kremlin, Soviet forces were already crossing the border. The invasion began at precisely 1 minute past midnight Transbaikal time. 3 massive fronts struck simultaneously across terrain the Japanese had considered impassable. The Transbaikal front smashed through the Greater Khingan mountain range, advancing across supposedly impossible desert terrain toward the heart of Manchuria. The first Far Eastern Front punched through Japanese fortifications along the Ussuri River, while the second Far Eastern Front swept down from the north. The Japanese defenders were overwhelmed instantly. Units that existed only on paper couldn't fight. Equipment that worked perfectly in staff reports broke down immediately under combat conditions. Communication systems failed. Supply lines collapsed. Command structures disintegrated. What the Japanese had claimed was an impregnable defensive system revealed itself as an elaborate fiction within hours of contact with the enemy. The speed of the Soviet advance defied all military precedent. Armoured spearheads of the 6th Guards Tank Army covered 300 miles in 6 days, racing through terrain that Japanese planners had declared impossible for large mechanized forces. Soviet engineers bridged rivers, cleared mountain passes, and built supply roads at a pace that left Japanese defenders scrambling to understand what was happening. Individual Japanese units fought bravely when they could, but bravery couldn't overcome the mathematical reality of the situation. Soviet forces outnumbered the Japanese by overwhelming margins at every point of contact. Where Japanese defenders deployed 1 tank, the Soviets brought 50. Where Japanese artillery fired a dozen shells, Soviet batteries responded with hundreds. The material disparity was so extreme that combat became less a battle than a demolition exercise. The psychological impact on Japanese forces was devastating. Many units surrendered without firing a shot. Others simply melted away, with soldiers discarding uniforms and fleeing toward Chinese villages. The Kwantung Army's morale, already weakened by years of defeats and shortages, collapsed entirely when faced with the reality of Soviet firepower. Japanese commanders frantically radioed Tokyo for instructions, reinforcements, or miracles. None were forthcoming. The High Command had no reserves to send, no equipment to spare, and no strategies that could address the scale of the disaster unfolding in Manchuria. For the first time in the war, Japanese military leaders were forced to confront the mathematical impossibility of their situation. By August 12th, just 3 days after the invasion began, Soviet forces had penetrated hundreds of miles into Manchuria. Key cities fell without significant resistance, railway junctions were captured intact, industrial facilities that Japan desperately needed were overrun by advancing Soviet columns. The economic heart of Japan's empire was being torn out with surgical precision. The strategic implications became clear immediately to those paying attention in Tokyo. General Torishiro Kawabe, Deputy Chief of the Army General Staff, summarized the situation with brutal honesty. The Kwantung Army was hopeless. Within 2 weeks, Changchun, the major city in central Manchuria, would be occupied by the Soviets. If the Soviets could advance that quickly through supposedly defended territory, what would happen when they turned their attention to the Japanese home islands? The answer was obvious and terrifying. Soviet forces were already positioning for potential operations against Hokkaido, Japan's northernmost island. Reconnaissance flights were mapping landing beaches. Naval units were moving into position. The prospect of fighting American forces advancing from the south while Soviet armies poured across from the north was strategically impossible. Japan would be crushed between 2 overwhelming forces attacking from opposite directions. But the military dimension was only part of the catastrophe. The Soviet invasion had destroyed Japan's last diplomatic option. For months, Japanese leaders had clung to the hope that Stalin might serve as a mediator, helping them negotiate surrender terms that would preserve the emperor system and avoid occupation. That hope died the moment Soviet tanks crossed the Manchurian border. The timing of the invasion, coinciding exactly with the atomic bombing of Nagasaki, created a perfect storm of strategic disasters that made Japan's position utterly hopeless. American nuclear weapons demonstrated that the United States possessed the capability to destroy Japanese cities at will. The Soviet invasion proved that Japan's industrial base and remaining military forces could be eliminated with conventional weapons. Together, these twin catastrophes left Japan with no military options, no economic resources, and no diplomatic alternatives. Emperor Hirohito himself grasped the implications immediately. In private conversations with his advisors, he acknowledged that continued resistance was meaningless. The war was lost. The only question was whether Japan would accept that reality before or after complete destruction. The Soviet invasion had made that choice inevitable. Invasion had made that choice inevitable. The mathematics of defeat became undeniable in the conference rooms of Tokyo on August 11, 1945. Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki sat across from his military advisors, staring at reports that read like a catalogue of impossibilities. The Kwantung Army was disintegrating faster than anyone had thought possible. Soviet forces were advancing at rates that exceeded even optimistic German blitzkrieg operations. The industrial cities of Manchuria were falling like dominoes, each one representing billions of yen in lost infrastructure and irreplaceable manufacturing capacity. General Yoshijiro Umezu, chief of the Army General Staff, delivered the assessment that shattered Japan's last illusions. The Soviets weren't just winning in Manchuria. They were demonstrating military capabilities that dwarfed anything Japan could field. Soviet logistics were moving supplies across thousands of miles of hostile territory without pause. Soviet coordination was synchronizing operations across multiple time zones with clockwork precision. Soviet firepower was obliterating Japanese positions faster than they could be abandoned. The strategic reality was inescapable. Japan had entered the war believing that American democracy was weak, that Soviet communism was inefficient, that Asian willpower could overcome Western materialism. Every assumption had proven catastrophically wrong. The Americans had built an industrial war machine that produced aircraft carriers like automobiles. The Soviets had created military forces that moved with mechanical efficiency across continental distances. Japan's spiritual advantages had collided with mathematical realities and been pulverized. But there was something even more devastating than the immediate military disaster. The Soviet invasion had revealed the fundamental delusion that had guided Japanese strategy since Pearl Harbor. Japanese planners had convinced themselves that their enemies were divided, that Stalin and Roosevelt were suspicious allies who might be turned against each other through diplomatic manipulation. The coordinated timing of atomic bombs and massive ground offensives proved that delusion false. American technology and Soviet manpower were working in perfect harmony to destroy Japan. The intelligence reports flooding into Tokyo painted a picture of systematic annihilation. Soviet forces weren't just defeating Japanese units, they were erasing them from existence. Entire divisions were vanishing from radio contact within hours of first engagement. Command posts that reported normal conditions at dawn were silent by noon. Supply depots that contained months of carefully hoarded ammunition were captured before they could be destroyed. The speed of collapse defied Japanese military doctrine, which had always emphasized fighting to the death rather than surrender. But doctrine meant nothing when facing forces that could advance faster than retreat orders could be transmitted. Japanese officers found themselves cut off from their units, their communications severed, their escape routes blocked by enemy forces that seemed to materialize from nowhere. The psychological impact on Japan's leadership was devastating. These were men who had spent their entire careers studying warfare, planning campaigns, calculating odds. They understood military mathematics as well as anyone alive. And those same mathematical skills that had once planned victories in China and Southeast Asia now calculated the precise impossibility of continued resistance. Finance Minister Junosuke Inoue presented economic projections that made the military situation even bleaker. Japan's economy was already operating on borrowed time, sustained only by resources extracted from conquered territories. The loss of Manchuria's industrial base would reduce Japanese war production by 60% within months. The steel mills, coal mines, and chemical plants that had powered Japan's military expansion were now producing weapons for the Soviet army. The human cost was equally staggering. Intelligence estimates suggested that over 300,000 Japanese civilians lived in Manchuria, many of them families of military personnel and industrial workers. These people were now trapped behind enemy lines, cut off from evacuation, facing an uncertain fate under Soviet occupation. The moral responsibility for their safety weighed heavily on leaders who had sent them to develop Japan's continental empire. 6 days later, Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled across radio speakers throughout Japan, announcing surrender to a nation that had never known defeat. But the war had really ended at 1 minute past midnight on August 9th, when Soviet artillery opened fire along the Manchurian border. The atomic bombs may have demonstrated American power, but the Soviet invasion had eliminated Japanese options. Stalin's promise to Roosevelt had been kept with devastating precision, and Japan's last hope had died in the Manchurian plains.